Verbal aspect. What has changed in Mounce's 4th edition over the 3rd edition? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look. Hi, I'm Daryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits, and systems for you to master the Greek of the New Testament and learn to read it fluently. If that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and hit subscribe and then hit the notify bell so you're notified when new videos are released. Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at this book in a little bit more detail. Now, in the 10 years since the 3rd edition of this book was released, New Testament scholars have continued to do significant work and have a lot of discussions and books and so on around the subject of verbal aspect. Now, we've covered verbal aspect on this channel before, and if you're interested in that, you'll find a link to one of the videos up here. Go ahead, click that to find out more about what verbal aspect is and why it's important. So the question here is, though, in the 4th edition, how are these changes reflected? Are they reflected at all? And in a nutshell, honestly, there's not a lot that's changed between the 4th edition of Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek and the 3rd edition. And while that might sound like no news is good news, this is actually news one way or another anyway. It's significant for two reasons, and I'm going to talk about those as we go through. But let's just talk about the few changes that are in the 4th edition when it comes to the question of verbal aspect. First of all, let's talk about terms. In the 3rd edition, Mounce refers to the continuous aspect, which we would regard today as the imperfective aspect, and he talks about the undefined aspect, which is what we would call the perfective aspect. And when you get into the perfect tense form in chapter 25 of the 3rd edition of Mounce, you're going to be confronted there with the perfective aspect. Does that strike you as a little odd? Now, in the 4th edition, those aspects have all been changed to reflect the new labels. So now, what used to be regarded as a continuous aspect is now the imperfective aspect. What used to be called the undefined aspect is now the perfective aspect. And the perfect tense form now represents the stative aspect rather than the perfective aspect. So at least now, these label changes are more consistent with what you're going to find in literature regarding verbal aspect. But sometimes Mounce will switch back and lead with the old labels such as continuous when he's talking about the imperfective tense form. He does this, for instance, when he's talking about the present tense form in chapter 16. Now, there's one other thing about the use of the way he describes the imperfective tense form. He describes it as a continuous tense form, still using the 3rd edition terminology to some extent. Now, it's okay to regard on occasion the idea of the action as being in progress, right? So you can't avoid that. That's part of what the imperfective aspect is designed to do, is to help you see the event from an in-progress point of view. However, that's a little different from describing it as an ongoing process or a continuous event, which is what Mounce tends to do when he's talking about the imperfective tense form. Now, in my opinion, this confuses Aktionsart and aspect. Now, Aktionsart is the way the verbs and the tense forms are used within the context and really describes the manner of use, where the aspect just tells you whether it's imperfective or perfective and the portrayal intended by the author. Now, a couple of things just while we're thinking about that. First of all, in the 3rd edition of Mounce, there was no discussion whatsoever even about the notion of Aktionsart. In the 4th edition, there is a brief discussion in chapter 15 about what Aktionsart is and its significance. But this is not brought out enough. And so in my opinion, the way Mounce describes the imperfective aspect using terms like continuous and an ongoing process, these actually tend to confuse Aktionsart with aspect. For instance, take the word pipto, to fall. Now, this is not a verb that tends to portray a continuous idea. However, in Mark chapter 14, verse 35, you find there pipto used with an imperfective aspect. Is this really to say that what Mark was trying to tell us here was that Jesus was continually falling, or that there was this process of falling? But that's not how the verb works. In fact, what we really need to understand here is that the meaning of the verb itself adds something to the imperfective idea to indicate the idea of a durative, progressive, or reiterative event. And so we can't just take it from the aspect. There are other clues, contextual clues, including the lexeme and including the aspect, that contribute to that as a whole. But you don't get any discussion about any of this, and all you're left to understand is that verbal aspect, the imperfective form, describes an in-progress event. So if something's falling, you're supposed to be kind of watching it happen. But the point that Mark is making in Mark chapter 14 verse 35 by using an imperfective tense form with a lexeme like pipto is to show you that, and to mark this event as standing out from the rest of the narrative. That's what he's doing with the imperfective tense form. And so we need to be wise about how we think through what the verbal aspect actually means in the context. And it doesn't always mean that an action is in progress or continuing. Now, I'm not saying that Mounce is trying to argue for those positions. All I'm saying is that this comes across a little confusing if you're used to or getting taught the idea of verbal aspect and you're working through Mounce's grammar at the same time. Now, one important aspect of verbal aspect that is entirely missing, actually there are a couple that are missing from the discussion of verbal aspect entirely, is the intentionality of the author. So verbal aspect gives the author the opportunity to portray an action as taking place in a certain way. And he gets to choose, pick and choose how he wants to portray the action taking place. And you can see in some of the synoptic distinctions that there are choices that the authors have made to describe the same event. And they've done it in different ways because they're trying to bring out the context and the text in slightly different ways. And therefore, by omitting to talk about the intentionality of the author and the option the authors have when they talk about verbal aspect, I think it really removes it just a little bit from what we are to understand from the text. Okay, so we're kind of left a little shortchanged in our understanding of the author's usage of the language itself. So when it comes down to it, I'd personally rather have students simply understand aspect from the point of view of the inside of an event, looking at it from within, maybe as an in-progress event, but not from I'm not saying that that event is continuing or is progressing, but just to look at it from the inside, and then to look at the perfective aspect from the outside as a whole. Those, I think, are the safest way to look at the imperfective and perfective tense forms. And so I would rather not have my students talk about the continuous aspect, okay, or use the words like continuous when it refers to aspect at all. This just runs the risk of confusing Aktionsart with aspect. Now, one important distinction in corollary that comes out that is still in the 4th edition of Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, that was also in the 3rd edition, is that he still argues there is time in the indicative mood. Now, there is some discussion around this still, but the point is that there is a growing consensus amongst scholars that there should not be, we should not consider time to be present in the indicative mood except for in the future tense form. Of all of the tense forms, the only one that truly portrays time is the future tense. So when Mounce talks about the augment, the prefix that goes on the front of imperfect and aorist tense forms, and the pluperfect for that matter as well, that this always refers to past time. Now, he also mentions in the book that these always go, the augment always goes with secondary endings. And the way most modern scholars and increasingly modern grammars talk about the augment is to say that the augment goes with secondary endings. And Mounce does talk about that. But my question is, well, if scholars are increasingly putting time aside when it comes to the indicative mood, why not just say that the augment is there because it goes with the secondary endings? That seems to make a lot more sense to me. Now, there's a lot more we could say about time and verbal aspect and the indicative mood. And again, I'll leave a link up here to another video that talks about time and aspect, so you can get a bit more on that. This video has gone long enough as it is. Let me just add one or two other things that I would like to have seen in the 4th edition of Mounce. First, I would have liked to have seen a discussion about remoteness. This is one of the things about, say, the perfective tense form, for instance, the aorist, that I think is important when it comes to the aorist tense form. It has this idea of remoteness. But he doesn't talk about that. Another one is he doesn't talk about the distinction between pragmatics and semantics, which I think is also a very helpful thing to talk about and helps students to understand what what is encoded in the actual form we're looking at and what comes from the context. Now, he does talk on page 156 about the unaffected and affected meaning, borrowing there from Wallace in his intermediate Greek grammar, where he talks about that, which are very close to semantics and pragmatics. And there's also no discussion, as I mentioned before, about the author's choice and how he wants to portray an event. So let's conclude our discussion about the 4th edition of Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek. Every grammar has its strengths and weaknesses, and this grammar is stronger now because of its treatment of the middle voice. And perhaps one of the strengths of this is that there aren't a lot of changes between the 3rd edition and the 4th edition, simply making this a good, serious continuation of the 3rd edition. However, personally, I would have liked to have seen some of the updates to verbal aspect reflected more fully in this volume. I think that with so many grammars, new grammars being released by scholars, such as Constantine Campbell, who has a beginning Greek grammar, such as Rodney Decker, who has a beginning Greek grammar, such as the forthcoming grammar by Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer, which will take verbal aspect into account. With these grammars coming out, you have to ask the question, why would you continue to teach the time-based approach to verbal aspect? And in my opinion, this makes this a bit of a risk from a longevity point of view. Will this be a book that is still being used in 5 years if there's an increasing movement away from time in the indicative mood to verbal aspect and a richer understanding of verbal aspect? Now, that's not to say that everything in verbal aspect is locked down, and that may be why Mounce has chosen to stick with the older approach of time, because at least there's some sort of consensus on it, even if it is steadily being replaced. But I think that this is one of those concerns that for us as both teachers and students we need to think through. What we're steadily seeing here is two groups form. On the one hand, we're seeing scholars starting to release and starting to talk about verbal aspect, and with a higher and increasing degree of consensus day by day, year by year. On the other hand, we're seeing teachers of biblical Greek who are holding on to the time-based approach until they are comfortable, and this is my guess a little bit, with the consensus in verbal aspect. But at what stage will the group of teachers cross over to verbal aspect? And why not do that kind of, once we start to see more consensus, as we are, I think, rather than waiting for that to happen? So this is one of those concerns. And for you, if you're a student, here's the question you want to ask yourself. Do you want to learn under the growing consensus from the scholars, those who are looking at the language richly? Or does that not matter to you and you really just want to learn Greek, and if you're getting taught the old way, it doesn't matter? This is a question you as a student need to understand. And from a teaching point of view, what is it that holds you on to the time-based approach? Is there something that keeps you there other than, and let me just disqualify one thing, other than it's easier for us as teachers to stick with what we know? Don't we have a responsibility to our students to continue to teach them and bring them up to date on what's going on in the discussions of the language? Now, again, that's not to say there's not any of those discussions in here. There are. Mounce does have a discussion about verbal aspect and does talk about some of the challenges that still exist in verbal aspect in chapter 15. So let me close this video by asking you, as you watch this, what would you rather learn? If you're a student, would you prefer to learn the old way that's tried and true, with the potential challenge or risk of having to relearn verbs later on? Or would you rather learn the growing consensus now and then backfill that with the older view as you go? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're a teacher and you're holding on to the time-based view, and I'm not arguing that it's wrong to do so, I'm just wondering, what is it that keeps you there? Why would you not choose to teach verbal aspect? I look forward to hearing from you in the comment section below. Again, if you're interested in learning Greek and mastering the Greek of the New Testament, and you're interested in learning the verbal aspect approach, then I encourage you to sign up to get my free roadmap to mastery at masterntgreek.com/roadmap. That's a short PDF that's going to give you the steps from wherever you are now to get you all the way to reading the New Testament fluently. So that's at masterntgreek.com/roadmap. If this has been helpful, go ahead, hit the like button below, hit the subscribe button, then hit the notify bell to be notified when new videos are released, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small steps to mastery, and I'll see you in the next video.